Hi guys, I hope you're doing well. I hope you had a really fantastic Christmas with your families, and I hope that you were able to stay safe and healthy through our Christmas celebrations. I know that I had a good time, um, just kind of chilling and seeing less people, but also being able to see some people I care about. So I hope you had a great time celebrating. Um, Last week, I we kind of took a pause from our normal curriculum in the book of Acts and returned to the Christmas story because it was pertinent, and I hope that you enjoyed it. This week, however, we're going back to our book of Acts. We are officially in chapter 9 of the book of Acts, section 3, I believe. I can check that real quick. We are in section 3 of our curriculum. So today I invite you to turn to page 144 if you have your books. If you don't, then that's fine. I will be reading it and kind of explaining a few things on the way that are helpful for us to understand what's going on more fully. If you remember, where we left off in the book of Acts was the stoning of Stephen. We looked around about Stephen's life and how he was preaching the gospel. And at the end of our last video, Stephen was stoned to death, and above him, holding a stone, was a man named Saul. Well, today we are exploring about this man named Saul. So I hope that you remember our last story because it's very important for today. We're exploring Saul, who turns into the Apostle Paul. This is a really, really exciting and important moment in the book of Acts, and I hope that you are as excited about joining the story as I am. So, we are in chapter 15 today. We are in a chapter titled Murderer Turned Apostle. And who is God? God is the merciful God in this chapter. And the lesson theme for today is that God transforms a murderer into a believer. Our God has the power to transform even the people that are farthest from him into a believer and follower of Christ. And today we are going to learn about an important figure in our Bible. The Old Testament and the New Testament revealed. What Old Testament passage speaks to our story today? And it comes from Isaiah 42:6, saying, I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness, to be a light for the Gentiles. And we're going to learn today about how the Apostle Paul kind of fit that bill. So I'm turning to page 145, and then I'm going to begin our story time for today if you want to join along. Murderer turned apostle. The man was like a wild and raging beast, furiously spewing out hateful threats and causing havoc, confusion, and disorder throughout Jerusalem. One purpose drove him relentlessly day after day: to rid the city of Jesus' disciples. He wanted to destroy the church and everyone who said he believed in Jesus Christ. With the authority of the high priest and the Sanhedrin behind him, Saul of Tarsus prowled Jerusalem's narrow streets. Like a raging lion or a wild boar, he went from house to house, and when he found what he was looking for, he dragged them, men and women, from their homes. All were imprisoned, and many were killed. So, first of all, I wanted to talk about some things in that paragraph just to clarify. So Paul Saul in this moment's hatred of the Christians was an obsession with Saul. He saw it as an affront to his Jewish faith. He was the Jew of the Jews. He was highly educated and faithful to the Jewish faith, and these Christian converts were traitors to the faith of him. So he was passionate in his hatred of Christians. Another thing I want to mention is that there's no mention of Saul actually killing anyone, but he approved their executions by casting votes against them. So in Stephen's case, Paul probably didn't actually kill Stephen, but he was a super influential in the decision to kill Stephen. I'm moving on to our second paragraph. In fear of their lives, the disciples scattered northward, many as far as Damascus in Syria. The scattering of believers throughout Palestine only intensified Saul's fury. He went to the high priest Cephas and requested letters to pursue the disciples to Damascus and bring them back to Jerusalem for trial. Saul knew that if this new religion was able to take hold in Damascus, it could then spread easily throughout the world, and he had to stop it. The journey from Jerusalem to Damascus was a steady, week-long trip by foot. As Saul and his companions neared the city, a brilliant light from heaven flashed around Saul, and he fell face down to the ground. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" a voice from heaven boomed. So I'm going to take a moment here to say that the conversion of Saul is actually mentioned 3 times in the book of Acts, and all of them are slightly different. But as I've said before about the Gospels, just because a story is slightly different doesn't mean that one of them is untrue. You can tell a story in many different ways based on who is listening. So, in each of the consecutive accounts, Paul is telling a different part of his story. He's telling it to different people. So you shouldn't be all that concerned if some of the details are slightly different, because Paul is just elaborating. The other thing is I want to say that this passage mentions a high priest named Cephas. But Cephas was the official high priest, but his father-in-law, Annas, was the former high priest and still had a lot of influence and power with the Sanhedrin. So when you're reading Luke, sometimes they're mentioned the high priests, plural of them. However, even though technically there are 2 of them, or technically there's only one high priest, and that high priest is Cephas, as this particular passage mentions. They often talk about Annas too. So they're both kind of important. I am moving on now. In the midst of this heavenly glow, Saul saw Jesus. Frightened and confused, Saul asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The voice answered, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you should do." The men in the caravan traveling with Saul heard the noise, but they didn't see anyone and couldn't understand the words being spoken. It was a terrifying experience. When Saul got up from the ground, he couldn't see anything. Saul realized that he was no longer in control of this mission. He was now following the order of Jesus Christ, the God-man whom he had vehemently been persecuting. Instead of entering Damascus as a proud, confident representative of the mighty Sanhedrin, Saul was blind and uncertain as to what would happen to him. His traveling companions led him by the hand into the city to the home of Judas on Straight Street. And for 3 days he sat huddled in a room, eating and drinking nothing. During this time he meditated and prayed. What do you think he prayed about? In another part of Jerusalem was a disciple named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, "Go to Judas's house and ask for Saul of Tarsus, for he is praying. He has seen a vision, and you will come to him and restore his sight." Ananias was understandably astonished at the Lord's request. He heard about all of the harm Saul had done to the Jerusalem church, and he was well aware that Saul had come to Damascus under the authority of the Sanhedrin to capture more believers. The Lord reassured Ananias, "I have chosen this man to take the gospel to the Gentiles. I will show him how much he will suffer in my name." Ananias listened to the Lord's words, and in faith he went to the house where Saul was staying. He believed that since the Lord had told him to go, it was important for him to obey, and the Lord would be with him. Entering the house, Ananias said, "Brother Saul." What comfort these words must have been to Saul. A disciple of Jesus had called him brother, even after all he had done. His conversion was recognized as genuine, and he was now considered a fellow disciple. Ananias put his hands on Saul and said, "The Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road, has sent me so that you can see again and so that you can be filled with the Holy Spirit." Immediately the scales fell from Saul's eyes and he could see once again. He was no longer blind. After being baptized, he ate food and gained strength. Saul spent several days with the disciples in Damascus. Right away, he had preached about Jesus Christ, the Son of God, in the Damascus synagogues. This is important because Saul preached that Jesus was the Messiah, the exact idea that had been a stumbling block for Saul, the persecutor. People who heard Saul preach were astonished and asked, "Isn't this the man who caused havoc in Jerusalem, hunting down and arresting Jesus' disciples? Isn't this the man sent by the Sanhedrin to our city to take prisoners back to Jerusalem?" Yes, it was the same man, but he was a changed man. As Saul continued to preach that Jesus was the Christ, he became more and more persuasive, and he baffled the Jews in Damascus. According to Paul's account of his conversion in Galatians 1, he left Damascus shortly after his conversion for Nabatea, a vast Arabian kingdom to the southeast of Judea. Throughout the major cities of Nabatea, Saul visited Jewish synagogues and called about Jesus. He also presented the gospel to Gentile converts to Jerusalem who were familiar with the Old Testament scriptures. No one knows how long Saul remained there, but based upon his personal account in Galatians, it seems that he was there for an extended period of time, possibly as long as 3 years. Saul returned to Damascus to spend time with the disciples there. As Saul's preaching became more powerful, he made some fierce enemies. The Damascus Jews hated Saul for preaching the gospel in the synagogues, and King Aretas, ruler of the Nabateans, resented Paul for trying to convert the Arabs. Together, the Nabatean government in Damascus and the angry Jews conspired to kill Saul. Damascus was a city enclosed by thick walls, and the only way in or out was through the city gates. Saul's enemies kept close watch day and night at the city gates. There was no way Saul could escape from the city. Then, one dark night, Saul's friends lowered him in a basket through a window in the city wall, and in the darkness he fled the city safely and headed to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was not welcoming to Saul. The believers questioned whether or not he was a changed man and were afraid of him. He talked and debated with the Greek Jews, but they viewed him as a threat to Judaism. Barnabas became Saul's friend and defended him to the apostles, telling them about his conversion and his fearless preaching of the gospel in Damascus. For 15 days, Saul walked around Jerusalem telling people about Jesus. When the believers learned that the Greek Jews were planning to kill him, they sneaked him out of Jerusalem and took him to Caesarea. What was Saul thinking as he fled Jerusalem, do you think? As a student, he had studied many years in Jerusalem under the famous rabbi Gamaliel. As a young man, he would have walked the courtyards of the magnificent temple, listening to the Levite choirs and seeing the giant temple candlesticks light up the city after dark. It was in Jerusalem that his passion against the new believers was fed into a raging flame of hatred. Now, Saul was a new man, a believer in Jesus Christ, And as a convert to the gospel, Jerusalem was not a safe place for him. It was time to go home to Tarsus. As he sailed for home, he must have been wondering, what does the Lord have for me to do next? Well, we may know what God had in store for Paul next. But in this point in the story, Saul had no idea. Saul was a man who was angry at the Christians and hated them with a fiery passion. But by the end of his encounter, Saul was a completely changed man and wrote a ton of our New Testament. So I think it's important as we're thinking about this story, I hope you are thinking about how merciful and just our God is. That God can change a man so completely as God changed Saul. And Saul wasn't a hopeless cause. No matter all the bad things that Saul did, God still was able to change him and use him for the kingdom. And I hope that's something that we can take to heart this week, that God is always a God who is able to change and redeem people, just like he did with Paul in this story. So I hope that you enjoyed our story time today. I love this story. If you want to read it in the gospel or in the actual book of Acts, just turn to Acts chapter 9 and you'll find the story there. I hope that you enjoyed our time, and I hope you have a wonderful new year. I'm thankful for fresh starts. So I hope that you have a great time. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you again next week. Happy Sunday, you guys.